The moment Thomas Winters first laid eyes on Eleanor Blackwell, he knew she wasn't the typical suburban neighbor. There was something rigid about her posture, something calculating in the way her eyes assessed the Winters property line, as if mentally erasing the beautiful red barn that had stood there for nearly a century. It was May 2023 when she moved into the Victorian house adjacent to the Winters' 5-acre hobby farm, a property that had been in Helen Winters' family for generations. "That barn is an eyesore," were the first words Eleanor spoke to Thomas, not even bothering with a hello as he approached her with a welcome basket his wife had prepared. "It completely ruins my view of the valley." Thomas had stood there, basket in hand, momentarily stunned. The 1930s barn, with its weathered red paint and white trim, was the centerpiece of their small farm, housing 2 horses, some chickens, and a workshop where Thomas restored antique furniture. Most people in Meadowbrook Valley considered it charming, a nostalgic reminder of the town's agricultural roots before development had transformed most of the surrounding land into cookie-cutter subdivisions. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Thomas had replied, forcing a smile. "We've always thought it was rather beautiful. I'm Thomas, by the way. Welcome to the neighborhood." Eleanor had taken the basket with a curt nod, her gaze still fixed on the barn rather than her new neighbor. "I paid a premium for this view. I wasn't told there would be an agricultural obstruction." That first encounter set the tone for what would become an increasingly tense relationship. At neighborhood gatherings, Eleanor would corner other residents, speaking in hushed tones while glancing toward the Winters property. Within weeks, Thomas and Helen began receiving pointed questions from neighbors they'd known for years. "Is that barn up to code? Are you sure your property is zoned for livestock? Have you considered painting it something less attention-grabbing?" Helen Winters, a local high school art teacher with a passion for photography, was particularly wounded by the Whisper campaign. The barn had been her grandfather's pride and joy. He built it with his own hands during the Depression, using timber from the property and techniques passed down through generations. Her childhood memories were intertwined with that structure, learning to ride her first pony in the attached paddock, helping her father repair the roof after storms, celebrating her 16th birthday with a barn dance that the whole town still talked about. "She's turning people against us," Helen confided to Thomas one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the barn in hues of gold and amber. "Mrs. Peterson canceled her standing order for eggs yesterday, said she was going store-bought from now on." Thomas squeezed his wife's hand. "It's just one difficult neighbor. This will blow over." But it didn't blow over. Instead, Eleanor Blackwell escalated. She filed complaints with the county about noise and odors. She petitioned the Historical Society to reconsider the barn's protected status, claiming it wasn't authentic to the period. She even installed bright security lights that shone directly into the Winters' bedroom window, claiming they were necessary because farm animals attract predators. The Winters tried everything to appease her. They reduced their chicken flock, moved the compost pile to the far side of the property, even offered to plant a row of fast-growing trees along the property line to block her view of the barn. Nothing satisfied Eleanor. Then came the Neighborhood Association meeting in late August. Eleanor had somehow managed to get herself elected as president despite being a newcomer. The first item on her agenda, a proposed aesthetic ordinance that would effectively force the Winters to tear down their barn. As Thomas and Helen sat in stunned silence at the back of the community center, they had no idea that this meeting was just the beginning. That in less than 3 months, their beloved barn would be reduced to ashes and Eleanor Blackwell would be standing in her perfectly manicured yard, pointing accusatory fingers their way. The Neighborhood Association meeting had been worse than Thomas and Helen could have imagined. Eleanor stood at the podium, a PowerPoint presentation meticulously prepared, showing unflattering angles of their barn, photos clearly taken with a zoom lens from her property. Property values, Eleanor emphasized, clicking through slides of real estate listings. "That's what we're discussing tonight. Studies show that non-conforming structures can reduce neighboring property values by up to 15%. Thomas had risen from his seat, trying to maintain his composure. That barn has stood there for 90 years. Most people move here because they appreciate the rural character it brings to our community. A few heads nodded in agreement, but Eleanor was prepared. She introduced a real estate appraiser, a cousin of hers, though she failed to mention that connection, who presented graphs and statistics that painted the Winters barn as a neighborhood liability. By the meeting's end, the association had voted to form a committee to study the impact of agricultural structures on residential aesthetics. Eleanor, of course, volunteered to chair it. "We're being railroaded," Helen whispered to Thomas as they walked to their car afterward. Several neighbors averted their eyes as they passed. September brought more than falling leaves to Meadowbrook Valley. Anonymous complaints led to a parade of county inspectors visiting the Winters property. First came zoning, then building code enforcement, followed by environmental health. Though each inspection ultimately cleared the barn, it had been grandfathered under older regulations and meticulously maintained. The constant scrutiny wore on the family. One evening in early October, Thomas returned home to find Helen sitting at the kitchen table, red-eyed and clutching a letter. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. Helen pushed the paper toward him. "Our insurance company. They're not renewing our homeowner's policy unless we make significant updates to the barn." Her voice broke. "Updates that would cost more than we can possibly afford." Thomas scanned the letter, his heart sinking. The required improvements, a complete electrical rewiring, sprinkler system installation, foundation reinforcement, would cost upwards of $50,000. "This isn't coincidence," he said, slumping into a chair. "Someone's been making calls." That same week, their daughter Lily came home from school in tears. As the only 12-year-old who lived on a small farm, she'd always been proud of her family's lifestyle. She could collect eggs, ride horses, and identify more bird species than most adults. But now classmates were teasing her, calling her barn girl and asking if she slept with the chickens. Madison said her mom told her our place is bringing down property values and making everyone poor. Lily sobbed into Helen's shoulder. Madison, they knew, was Eleanor Blackwell's niece. Halloween approached, and with it came an unexpected olive branch. Eleanor invited the entire neighborhood, including the Winters, to a harvest party at her home. "Perhaps we gotten off on the wrong foot," she told Helen when delivering the invitation in person. "I thought this might be a chance for us all to come together as neighbors." Helen was skeptical, but Thomas convinced her to attend. "We can't isolate ourselves," he reasoned. "If we want community support, we need to be part of the community." The party, I discovered too late, was another calculated move in Eleanor's campaign. As guests mingled in her impeccably decorated home, she unveiled architectural renderings for what she called the Meadowbrook Vista Project, a proposed community green space that would require the demolition of certain outdated structures to restore the natural sightlines of the valley. The plans, printed on glossy boards and displayed prominently, showed a park-like setting where the Winters barn currently stood. "Isn't it lovely?" Eleanor gushed to a group of neighbors, champagne flute in hand. "I'd already discussed preliminary funding with the county. They're quite supportive of green space initiatives." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as he studied the renderings. Their property, their home, had been incorporated into Eleanor's vision without so much as a conversation with them. The siren wail split the night as Thomas and Helen stood in their yard, watching helplessly as flames consumed generations of memories. The ancient timber frame of the barn, dried by decades of sun and wind, burned with an intensity that pushed back the firefighters attempting to control the blaze. The horses, thankfully, had been saved. Thomas had rushed to free them from their stalls the moment he smelled smoke. The chickens weren't as fortunate. "Stand back, sir," a firefighter urged, guiding Thomas away from the heat. "There's nothing more you can do." Helen clutched Lily to her chest, both of them weeping as sparks spiraled into the night sky. Neighbors in pajamas and winter coats gathered at a safe distance, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. Among them stood Eleanor Blackwell, somehow fully dressed in a camel hair coat and leather boots, her expression a carefully composed mask of concern. "How terrible," she murmured to anyone who would listen, "though I can't say I'm surprised." By dawn, only charred beams and smoldering ash remained where the barn had stood. The fire chief approached Thomas, clipboard in hand, expression grim. "Mr. Winters, we need to discuss the probable cause of the fire." Thomas, exhausted and shell-shocked, nodded. "Electrical? We had the wiring checked last year, but the insurance company said." "No, sir," the chief interrupted. "Our preliminary investigation indicates an accelerant was used, likely gasoline based on the burn pattern and speed of ignition." The words took a moment to register. "Are you suggesting arson?" The chief lowered his voice. "We found a gas came out 50 yards from the structure, partially hidden in the brush near your property line, and there are distinctive pour patterns." A cold dread settled in Thomas's stomach as he glanced across the yard where Eleanor stood with a small cluster of neighbors, gesturing toward the ruins, clearly holding court. "We've already called in the county fire investigator," the chief continued. "This is now a criminal investigation." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the devastation, a news van pulled up. The local reporter, a young woman with a determined expression, made a beeline for Helen. Before Thomas could intervene, Eleanor intercepted the reporter. "It's just devastating," Eleanor said, voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion to those who didn't know better. "The poor Winters family. Though I should mention," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "they've been having insurance troubles recently. The barn needed expensive repairs they couldn't afford." The insinuation hung in the air like the smoke still rising from the ruins. By afternoon, the story had spread through Meadowbrook Valley. The historic barn was gone, destroyed in a suspicious fire. The county fire investigator collected evidence while police officers took statements from neighbors. When they approached Eleanor, she was ready with a rehearsed account. I was up late reading when I noticed a figure moving near the barn with what looked like a flashlight, she told the detective, her voice steady. Then about 20 minutes later, I saw the flames and called 911 immediately. The detective made notes. Did you recognize the figure? Eleanor hesitated, the perfect pause of someone reluctant to cast suspicion. I couldn't be certain. It was dark, but it did look like Mr. Winters. Thomas, overhearing this from where he sat on his porch steps, lunged to his feet. That's a lie. I was asleep until the smoke alarm went off. The detective held up a calming hand. Sir, we're just gathering statements at this point. But the damage was done. By evening, whispers circulated through the neighborhood. Insurance fraud, a desperate attempt to solve financial problems, a dangerous old structure finally dealt with. 3 days after the fire, Thomas and Helen sat across from Detective Rivera in the police station, their attorney beside them. The detective slid photographs across the table, the charred gas can, burn patterns on what remained of the barn floor, footprints preserved in the mud near the property line. The good news, Rivera said, is that we don't believe either of you were involved. Helen let out a breath she'd been holding for days. The footprints don't match your shoes, Mr. Winters. They're high-end women's boots, size 7. And the gas can has fingerprints that don't belong to anyone in your family. Thomas leaned forward. Then, we're not ready to make accusations, Rivera cut him off. But we've applied for a warrant to search neighboring properties for matching footwear. That evening, the Winters returned home to find a bouquet of flowers on their doorstep with a card expressing Eleanor's deepest sympathies for their loss. The calculated gesture made. The morning after Eleanor's detention, Meadowbrook Valley awoke to media vans lining the main street. The story had captured attention beyond their small community. A wealthy developer, allegedly burning down a historic barn over a view dispute, held all the elements of sensational news. Thomas and Helen declined interview requests, shuttering their windows against the intrusive lenses. Lily stayed home from school. The family huddled in their living room as their phones buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends, family, and strangers who had seen the news. I can't believe she'd actually go this far, Helen said, staring out at the blackened footprint where the barn had stood for nearly a century. All for a view. The arraignment came 2 days later. The Winters family sat in the courtroom's front row, watching as Eleanor Blackwell entered in handcuffs, her usual confident stride diminished, designer clothes exchanged for a conservative Navy suit that couldn't quite disguise the circumstances. The charges were read aloud: second-degree arson, filing a false police report, insurance fraud. She had already contacted her homeowner's insurance claiming smoke damage to her property and attempted framing of an innocent party. Eleanor pleaded not guilty, her voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. Her attorney, a sharp-dressed man from a prestigious city firm, immediately requested bail. Ms. Blackwell is a respected businesswoman with deep ties to the community, he argued. She poses no flight risk. The prosecutor countered with evidence of Eleanor's extensive travel records and property holdings in 3 states. Furthermore, she added, Ms. Blackwell has demonstrated a concerning pattern of destroying evidence. When police executed their search warrant, they discovered her attempting to wash ash residue from her boots and delete text messages. The judge set bail at $500,000, high enough to make a statement, but not beyond the means of someone with Eleanor's resources. She was released that afternoon, returning to her home under strict conditions, including an ankle monitor and orders to stay at least 500 feet from the Winters property. News cameras captured her exit from the courthouse, face partially hidden behind large sunglasses despite the overcast day. Her attorney issued a brief statement claiming his client was the victim of circumstantial evidence and small-town prejudice against successful outsiders. That evening, an unexpected visitor knocked on the Winters' door. It was Victor Blackwell, Eleanor's ex-husband. I came as soon as I heard, he said, his expression grim. I'm so sorry for what Eleanor has done to your family. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Victor revealed what the Winters hadn't known, that Eleanor's obsession with views and property aesthetics had a long, troubling history. She did something similar in Lakeview Falls, he explained. Not arson, but she harassed an elderly couple who wouldn't sell their cottage until they finally gave in. The property blocked her view of the lake. It was one of the reasons for our divorce. Her fixations became increasingly concerning. Victor offered to provide a statement to the prosecution detailing Eleanor's history of property disputes and what he described as an unhealthy obsession with controlling her surroundings. As news of Eleanor's arrest spread, the Winters began receiving more than just sympathy. Neighbors who had initially sided with Eleanor now approached with apologies and offers of help. The Historical Society launched a fundraising campaign to document and potentially rebuild the barn using traditional methods. A local architect volunteered to create plans based on old photographs. Most surprisingly, 3 days after the arraignment, the Winters received a certified letter from Eleanor's niece's parents, Eleanor's sister and brother-in-law. They expressed their horror at Eleanor's actions and enclosed a check for $25,000 as a first step toward making amends for the harm our family member has caused yours. We can't accept this, Thomas said, pushing the check across the table. Helen placed her hand over his. It's not about the money, Tom. It's about them acknowledging what she did, taking responsibility even when she won't. The community's response continued to evolve. At an emergency neighborhood association meeting, Eleanor was unanimously removed from her position as president. The aesthetic ordinance proposal was permanently shelved, and a new committee was formed to protect and preserve historic structures in the area. Spring arrived in Meadowbrook Valley with a gentle persistence, coaxing new growth from soil that had lain dormant through winter. 6 months had passed since the fire, 5 since Eleanor Blackwell began serving her sentence at the county correctional facility. Where the barn had once stood, a foundation was taking shape. Not concrete, as modern buildings demanded, but a traditional stone base laid by hand. A painstaking process that drew curious onlookers from throughout the county. Thomas worked alongside the stonemasons, learning techniques that had nearly vanished from common practice. My grandfather would have done it this way, he explained to visitors who questioned the labor-intensive method. We're not just rebuilding a structure, we're preserving knowledge. The project had taken on significance beyond the Winters family. Every weekend, volunteers arrived to help, retired carpenters sharing wisdom with high school students, neighbors bringing food for the workers, children collecting smooth stones from the creek for the foundation's core. The barn's reconstruction had become a community endeavor, a living workshop in traditional building methods. Funding came from unexpected sources. The Historical Society's campaign had succeeded beyond their hopes, attracting attention from preservation groups across the state. A documentary filmmaker was capturing the rebuilding process, interviewing old-timers who remembered when such barns dotted the landscape. The county had matched the preservation fund established with part of Eleanor's restitution payment. Helen, who had initially been the most devastated by the loss, found herself taking on a new role as the project's historian. She compiled photographs, stories, and building details, creating an archive that would ensure the barn's legacy continued regardless of what the future might bring. In a strange way, she confided to Thomas one evening as they reviewed the week's progress, Eleanor's awful act might end up preserving more history than if the barn had simply stood for another 100 years, quietly aging. Eleanor's Victorian house stood empty, a for sale sign swaying in the spring breeze. As part of her plea agreement, she had agreed to sell the property, with a percentage of the proceeds going to the preservation fund. There had been little interest from buyers, however. The notoriety of the case had created a stigma that real estate agents struggled to overcome. In late April, as the stonework neared completion and timber framing was about to begin, the Winters received an unexpected letter. The return address was the county correctional facility. Helen stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single page of prison stationery covered in Eleanor's precise handwriting. Asterisk to the Winters family asterisk. Asterisk words of apology seem wholly inadequate for the harm I've caused you. My court statement, while truthful, was coerced by legal necessity rather than genuine remorse. I write now 5 months into my incarceration because something has changed within me asterisk. Asterisk, the court-mandated therapy I initially resented has forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. My obsession with controlling my surroundings, with perfection and appearances, has cost me everything: my marriage, my freedom, my reputation, and any chance of belonging to a community asterisk. Asterisk, I've been following the barn reconstruction through newspaper articles my sister brings during visits. What you're creating is remarkable. Not just a building, but a bridge between past and future. It's everything I failed to understand about what makes a place truly valuable asterisk. Asterisk, I have no right to ask forgiveness, nor do I expect it. But I wanted you to know that your family's grace in the face of my cruelty has affected me more deeply than any punishment the court could impose asterisk. Asterisk with sincere remorse, asterisk, asterisk, Eleanor Blackwell, asterisk. Helen passed the letter to Thomas without comment. After reading it, he set it on the kitchen table between them. Do you think she means it? Helen asked finally. Thomas considered the question. Maybe. People can change, or maybe it's another calculation, setting up for early release or a future lawsuit. He shrugged. Either way, it doesn't change what we're doing. They didn't respond to the letter, but Helen tucked it into the growing archive of documents related to the barn. Whatever Eleanor's true motives, the letter was now part of the story. By mid-June, the timber frame rose against the summer sky, each massive beam carefully